By the early 1900s, Belfast and Dublin were already the two most important cities in Ireland. Belfast was the industrial capital, and Dublin was the political and administrative capital. So it was logical that the first long-distance railway in the country should link the two cities. But the plan revealed some problems, in particular a rivalry between the cities that had been in keen competition since the Act of Union.
It started with plans for two entirely separate railways. The success of the Dublin-Kingstown Railway spurred the businessmen of Belfast in 1833 to lobby Parliament for their own railway. 3 years later, the British Parliament passed an act for making a railway from the town of Belfast to the city of Armagh in the province of Ulster. The act went on to declaim that the railway would provide the means of transit for passengers, goods and merchandise between those places and the adjacent districts and the several intermediate towns. The investors were Ulster businessmen and landowners, whom, it was noted, shall bear their own costs and charges to carry out the undertaking of the railway. 12 months later, in March 1837, from what's now Great Victoria Street Station, began the construction of the first line out of Belfast, the 37-mile stretch to Armagh via Portadown. Meanwhile, in Dublin, other entrepreneurs, headed by the Tory MP G.A. Hamilton, were conceiving another railway to go north from Dublin to Drogheda.
They began independently, quite independently. There was not an intention, or at least there wasn't a plan of joining up. And the Ulster Railway was to serve the local Belfast economy and its linkage across the sea with Lancashire and with Glasgow. And the Dublin and Drogheda began simply to link up two towns, the capital and the next biggest town to the north, both deemed to be profitable for various reasons. The Ulster Railway more for goods traffic, the Dublin and Drogheda more for passenger traffic.
The idea soon emerged to join up the two railways in order to create a rail link between Dublin and Belfast. However, the northern proprietors of the Ulster Railway still wanted to serve Ulster first, and only then via Armagh City and Navan to Dublin.
In Dublin, on the other hand, a view was emerging that it would be better if the railway were to follow a coastal route. It would be a shorter and cheaper way of connecting the twin capitals. This view was reinforced in 1836 when funds collapsed for a plan to connect Drogheda to Armagh. There were various reports and commissions, and in the end, a government ministry had to be brought in to referee the dispute.
In their wisdom, the Board of Trade of the day decided that a railway between the two capitals was a very good idea, and they promoted the idea of the Dublin-Belfast junction, getting an Act of Parliament to connect Portadown and Drogheda and give a true route along the coast and serve all the principal towns, including Newry.
But no sooner was the disagreement over the route resolved than another seemingly more intractable argument arose.
The Ulster built on a 6-foot 2-inch gauge, which had been recommended by the Drummond Commission, the railway commission that met in the mid-1830s. The Kingstown was 4 foot 8.5, if I remember rightly, 4 foot 8.5, which is the English gauge. The Drogheda began thinking of going on a 6-foot 2-inch gauge, and the engineer, Sir John McNeill, said, you don't need a 6-foot 2-inch gauge. 6 foot 2 inches for really wide, for really heavy traffic. You're not going to have that level of traffic. It's going to increase your construction costs. You should have a narrower gauge. And he recommended 5 foot 2. So now you had the prospect of a line coming out of Belfast on a 6 foot 2-inch gauge, already building, and a 5 foot 2-inch gauge coming out of Dublin. So even the boys could work out that this really isn't the cleverest thing to be doing. So they get a government arbitration. And the arbitrator takes the opinion, he sounds the opinion of engineers, Irish engineers, English engineers, and there are two main bodies of opinion emerge. One for a 5 foot gauge, right? And the other for a 5 foot 6-inch gauge. That's how Ireland got a 5 foot 3-inch gauge as its national gauge. And the Ulster had to change, and the Drogheda turned to 5 foot 3 instead of at 6 foot 2. And so that's how the national gauge emerged, by a time-honoured principle which owes nothing to engineering, technology or anything else like that. You split the difference.
So now in 1840, North and South could set about linking up by rail, an outcome helped through Parliament by Daniel O'Connell, who believed in the railways both as examples of progress and to provide famine relief work. The Dublin-Drogheda line was opened in March 1844, and as a thank you to O'Connell, by now an elderly and ill man, he was given a preview of the route in a special train with a military band. Sharing the acclaim with O'Connell was a man less well known to the public, but whose role was crucial. John McNeill, chief engineer of the line, was one of those engineers without whose skills the railways could not have been made. To recognise his great achievement, on the 24th of May 1844, before the first official train left Amiens Street Station for Drogheda, John McNeill was knighted by the Lord Lieutenant. Beyond Drogheda, the next challenge was to bridge the River Boyne, a formidable natural barrier between north and south. The Boyne ran through a wide, deep valley, gouged out of the soft terrain by the river over millions of years. Nothing like the bridge required to cross it had been built before.
The most demanding challenge that I think the engineering of Irish railways confronted. Now, it wasn't a challenge in the sense that they knew how to build viaducts. It wasn't having to pioneer a new technology, but it was applying an existing technology on a very ambitious scale. And Sir John McNeill was the engineer. He was the leading Irish engineer. He had a very good record for sound engineering. And the viaduct was successfully completed, as I said, with a number of lives lost, but very sadly, but lives are lost on every major engineering venture of that sort. And it took them a couple of years longer to cross the Boyne than it did to open the different sections of the railway. But obviously, once it was there, it was there. And you can still see today crossing over just what a challenge it must have been.
The Boyne Viaduct was originally designed by Sir John McNeill, and he had organised for a contractor from Cambridge, William Evans, to construct the viaduct. But they ran into serious difficulties with the soft clay beneath the river, and they had to go to considerable depths to get bases for the viaduct. However, they eventually got the piers up, but the contractor went bankrupt, and the Dublin and Belfast Junction Railway took over the construction of the viaduct themselves under the engineering skills of James Barton. And he was the first graduate engineer of Dublin University. And he designed the lattice section with McNeill originally, but he proved the theory of the lattice girder viaduct by scientific mathematical calculations. And it was put up as the largest lattice girder span in Europe at the time.
Even as the Boyne was being bridged, the Dublin-Belfast Junction Railway, a company established specifically to connect the Dublin-Drogheda Railway to the Ulster Railway at Portadown, had been building. First, south from Dundalk to Drogheda. Then, north from Dundalk to Newry. And beyond.
On the north side of Newry, there's a viaduct at Craigmore, which is the highest viaduct in Ireland. And that had to be constructed over a valley between Bessbrook and Newry. And then the line continued along by the Ulster Canal to Poynt's Pass, over relatively marshy countryside. And the railway then served the important town of Portadown, and then the linen towns of Lisburn and Largan, before going through to Belfast.
The line was at last completed, and the first train ran along its entire length in 1855. It had taken 10 years of planning and 18 years of building, thousands of labourers, many deaths and losses of limbs, 3 commercial companies, and not a few bankruptcies to link Belfast to Dublin by rail. Traversing valleys and gorges with bridges to carry horse and carriage was one thing. Building structures that would safely support a locomotive pulling carriages and passengers with a combined weight of several hundred tons, that was another thing. This is how it was done, thanks to the Industrial Revolution. Although the principle of the arch, equal and opposite forces creating stability, went back to the Romans, it was the mass production of bricks and steel, as well as a plentiful supply of labor, which created these magnificent viaducts. Despite famine and political unrest, from the mid-19th century onwards, the railways continued to spread throughout the northeast. One by one, independent branch lines merged with the Dublin to Belfast to become, in 1875, the Great Northern Railway Ireland.
There were a number of other companies absorbed, which took the Great Northern Railway right out to Bundoran, through Monaghan, Clones, Enniskillen, and then up through Omagh into Derry, and also from Derry back to Portadown. And also at Drogheda, you had the branch to Navan Kells, which was originally meant to be the main line, but the branch was constructed inland to serve those towns along the Boyne Valley. And that enhanced the importance of Drogheda along the route. Dundalk probably got more benefit from the coming of the railway than any other town along the route, because the main railway engineering centre for the Great Northern Railway was at Dundalk, and it was here that they actually built their locomotives. Also, from Dundalk, a separate company was set up, the Dundalk Uriah Greenore Railway, to provide a rail link from Dundalk to Greenore and a direct steamer service to Holyhead, and this survived until 1951.
Dundalk also boasts a prime example of the very distinctive Great Northern stations, designed by William Hamilton Mills.
William Hamilton Mills was a very influential engineer with the company at the time. And they adopted a policy of building stations in ochre brick with trim of red, black and blue. And a number of these stations, notably Malahide and Dundalk, survive to this day. Also along the line at Dundalk, there was an ironworks run by James Manistee. And this ironworks supplied many of the footbridges to the entire country, as well as some very fine cast iron roof beams, again notably at Dundalk and Malahide.
I think the railway stations, by and large, are very impressively built in many ways. I mean, even the small ones, you can get beautiful, both design and craft work in places where you mightn't get it today. But I think it is something that's well worth stressing, because many of them are little gems of their type. And because we have been, alas, our visual education has been so neglected, it's a sort of thing that passes virtually unnoticed in the history of the Irish landscape. And I think well deserves emphasising.
One fine example of a smaller Great Northern station survives at Moira in County Down. Just inside the door was the ticket office. Opposite, the first-class waiting room. Then, along the corridor, this was the main waiting room. In here you can still feel something of what it must have been like in the 1800s on a cold winter's morning waiting for the Belfast train. A fire blazing, the smell of damp coats and pipe smoke, the sound of northern voices discussing the day's news from the Crimea or from the Transvaal.
You've no relations to South Africa, have you, ma'am?
By the turn of the century, when Ulstermen were fighting in the Boer War, their ancient province had been transformed by the expansion of its rail routes, perhaps even more than the rest of Ireland.
The difference between the Great Northern and the other main lines was simply the development of the northeastern economy, the development of the Belfast economy. Belfast as a rapidly growing city in the second half of the 19th century, went up from, I think, 100,000 to 300,000, something like that, between, say, 1850 and 1914, whereas Dublin virtually stagnates at around the 300,000 mark, but it stagnates. So there's the growth of the northeast, and it's not just Belfast. I mean, you have along the line, you've Lurgan, you've Portadown. That then begins to level off once you come down a bit further south. But there's heavier goods traffic on the Great Northern in the Belfast direction than you will get in any of the southern main lines. And that's really the main difference between them. It also meant, of course, that you could rely on a growth of goods traffic in the northeast because there's this projection of economic virility in a way, indefinitely into the future, down to 1914. So that lent perhaps a greater shade of optimism to management perspectives about the almost the eternal verities of the future. And that's why, in a sense, the shock in 1914, or particularly the shock when the motor car then comes, it's after the First World War really, the shock is actually, if anything, greater in the northeast to the GNR there than it is further south, where there is a greater sense of, shall I say, the ephemerality of human achievement.
The boon of the railways did not come to Ulster without a price. As well as goods traffic, recreational travel had been opened up. Day excursions to the seaside had become popular. One such excursion was to have a terrible and far-reaching outcome. On a particularly sunny Sunday, many more families than expected turned up for a Methodist Sunday school excursion from Armagh, and extra rolling stock was put on to carry them. But the locomotive wasn't powerful enough to pull all 15 carriages up the first incline, and the train had to stop. It tried again with only the first 6 carriages, but again it lost traction, and the 6 carriages rolled back into the stationary 9, setting the whole train rolling back down the slope. Tragically, another train was approaching from Armagh, and because at that time there were no signals, it couldn't be stopped. The second train collided with the first with such force that 4 carriages disintegrated. 80 people, many of them children, died, and many more were terribly injured. Market Hill, June the 12th, 1889.
In that year, the Regulation of Railways Act was passed, requiring all railways to have proper signalling. And the Great Northern Railway went in for a major renewal programme at that stage, both in signalling and stations.
Despite its setbacks, even the most tragic ones, the Great Northern Railway progressed into the 20th century as an integral element of the northeastern landscape. Uphill and down dale, sometimes using omnibuses to ferry passengers between small lines in remote areas, negotiating across rivers and valleys, laying lines over bog and marsh. By the outbreak of the First World War, most of the populated areas of Ulster had been colonised by the railways. When Ulster's resistance to being a part of the Irish Free State led to partition in 1921, the Great Northern found itself straddling the border. Subsequently, following nationalisation of the Irish railways in 1953, the GNR came under the management of 2 states.
And of course the railway became famous for the various smuggling antics which the passengers got up to. Examples where boxes of butter were hidden in the water in the tender. Bicycle parts were imported the same way. People with small items such as jewellery bought a pint of stout before they left one jurisdiction and simply dropped the jewellery into the Guinness or whatever while they were crossing the border, and then, having consumed the product on the south side, recovered their jewellery. And then other people got shopping bags and put goods into them and hung them on the handles of the coaches on the opposite side of the train to which the customs were examining from the platform.
Today, 2 separate government agencies, Northern Ireland Railways and Iarnród Éireann, run what was once the single entity of the Great Northern Railway. But despite politics, the common business of running a railway on a day-to-day basis promotes cooperation.
I suppose it's an ideal model for cross-border cooperation, and not one occasion can I recall where there was any rancor, or we might have disagreements in relation to how many trains we should be operating between the two cities and things like that. But we've had a most great relationship, I must say, and I've always said to people that if you could put this model in other locations, it would be very interesting. Both of us had a common objective to give a good service to the public, and we had difficult periods where we had bomb scares along the border, etc. But we survived all that, and now we have a real success, I think, on our hands at the moment.
It's easy now to forget just how bad the Troubles were. The worst year was 1988, and during that year, on 186 days, the enterprise service was either disrupted or unable to operate at all. That's virtually half the year. So that gives some measure of the extent of the disruption. But it wasn't just that year. This went on for nearly 30 years. No matter what their background personally, they were railwaymen first and foremost, and together they maintained the service right throughout those 30 very difficult years. And they've left us now with a legacy of a service that's first class, and that wouldn't have been possible but for the efforts of the railway staff throughout the Troubles.
They obviously are both, in a way, prisoners of the general political situation, and they have to operate within the confines imposed on them. It means in particular that in the south, once particularly the railways are nationalised, that the southern management has to answer to the Dublin government, and pari passu, northern management in due course has to answer to the Belfast regime or the British government subsequently. And so the differences are likely to be more between government attitudes than they are between those of railway people themselves, who still, I think, recognise common challenges and understand the nature of the problem confronting their colleagues across the border in either direction.
I see the enterprise as a symbol of hope for the future, a symbol that has arisen out of adversity, a symbol of great hope for everyone on the island as we head towards the millennium.
Empires rise and fall, but railways survive. Market forces often overcome ideology, and the need for personal mobility is greater than any prejudice. Dublin and Belfast are now connected by the Enterprise, one of the most advanced passenger rail services in the world, which is run jointly by Ian Rodarin and Northern Ireland Railways in its own distinctive livery, and running essentially on the old Great Northern Line. It's possible to see something symbolic in the story of the Great Northern and the Enterprise at this time of hope in Ireland.
Train on a journey, train on a track. Take me where I want to go, take me back. Building the line by the sweat of your brow and the strength of your own hand. With stone, steel and sand, ironing the land. Railway sleeper, get no rest. Ride the iron horse into the west, with a pick and a shovel to the mountain pass. The boys of the Barrow gang, with stone, steel and sand, ironing the land.